Hey everybody, welcome to this week's live stream. So welcome back for everybody who's my regular viewers, and if you're new here today, welcome to the stream. So today we're going to have part 4 of a talk that I've been giving obviously the last 3 weeks and now the 4th week, called What the Game Designer's Job and What Do We Really Do? And I think there has been a lot of misconceptions about what a game designer really does. And, this talk is going to kind of, go through and really try to talk about what game designers really do, what our job is really like. And today we're going to dive, a lot deeper into some of the really meat of kind of like what we do, in our job. So, hey, Big Lob, good to see you. Welcome back. And I think you're the only one here with us today so far. So, hi, Cassie. Yay, we got 2. I'll just do a really quick recap. Going to try to just stall for a couple minutes to see if a few more people show up before we dive in. This was originally going to be a week of conversation. We're now in week 4. So we definitely, I'm as usual talking way too much, but hopefully everybody's getting something useful out of this and enjoying the series. And actually, it was exciting to know, and thank you for everybody that's watching live and watching this, recorded. But the first 4 weeks ago, the first part of this actually had my highest number of views of any live stream yet. So after, I don't know how many episodes now. I've lost track. I think we're in the 50 episodes now or something like that. So getting close to almost 100 hours of content. So again, if you guys are new and you haven't watched and seen the rest of my channel, here at CG Spectrum and what I've been doing in the game design world, there's 40 or 50, 2-hour episodes there on all sorts of topics. So definitely go check those out if you haven't seen them and you're interested in becoming a game designer or you want to be a better game designer. Definitely, check those out. And then if you're interested in art and using Unreal or anything else, CG Spectrum's got, live streams every single day, about all sorts of stuff. So we've got, I don't even know, there's has to be, 500 hours or something of content now on our channel. So hopefully all of you appreciate that, and hopefully it's helping make you a better designer or artist or whatever, you're trying to be in the world. So let's just do a really, really quick, spend a couple minutes and kind of go through where have we been, right? And, we talked about, and again, this was all covered in depth, the last 3 weeks. So I'm not going to try to cover this quickly, but just to kind of bring up to speed of where we're at. We talked about the types of designers out there, why the job is really important, talking about creating in general, and what we do really is we create things and we bring ideas to life, right? And, hold on a sec. We're getting bots. 1 second here. He's driving me crazy. It's getting worse and worse and worse. Wow, this is the most bots I've ever seen in one stream. I don't know what's with people and why they think that's acceptable just to spam everything. So, I don't know if that deletes it out. It looks like on YouTube that doesn't, deleted it on mine, but it doesn't look like it actually deletes them on YouTube. So, oh well. Please ignore all those. And then we got into, what does a game designer really do? What's that job really like? And again, I started this whole stream because a lot of my students and just people I talk to in general don't know what a game designer really does, and they don't know what our real job is like. And there's often a disconnect there for people that even come to CG Spectrum or try to get into the industry in general, and they get in and like day one they're like, oh my god, this is not what I thought being a game designer really is. And a lot of people think this is a really easy job that we just kind of play games all day and do nothing else. That's called a game tester or a QA, person. And trust me, I've never been officially really a QA person, although back I did some QA for Atari back in 1985, I think, ancient times ago, back on the Atari 2600. But trust me, I have to, as a game designer, I got to QA my own games, and that is the worst job ever. And while that may be the kind of entry level where a lot of people enter into the industry, It's a really hard job. Imagine playing the same game or the same level of a game for like 8, 10, 15 hours a day, 7 days a week, brutal, and the level's broken. You get halfway through, it crashes. You got to play it again, crashes, play it again, crashes. You want to kill yourself after like day 3 if you're a QA tester. For me, it's so repetitive, and you're looking for little small things and stuff. It's definitely not a fun job. So, the job of a game designer is a very different job than the job of QA. But even the job of QA is not as glamorous as it sounds like. Even if you are just wanting to play games all day long, trust me, it's not as glamorous as it sounds. A big part of what we do is research. We got to figure things out. Like everything we do, kind of, we got to look at the competitors. We got to look at different genres. We got to look at lots and lots of stuff, and we try to understand, what it is about, making a game that's going to be fun and interesting, and what's the material for that game. A big part of our job is just being great communicators, and we have to talk all day long and write documents and do all sorts of stuff, manage up to executives and manage to our team and, all sorts of stuff. So communication, writing, whether that's in meetings, emails, documents, video chats, whatever it is, like we do a lot of that, and it's just constant. So if you're an introverted person, being a game designer is not a great career choice, because we definitely are the social butterflies of the world. So, and, it comes back to politics again. We deal with a lot of politics, and, everybody thinks they can be a game designer. And so we have to learn how to take criticism, take feedback, and find solutions and understand what's important to people. And that's, a big part of our job. We also have to solve problems, and this is really the heart of what we do. We're constantly being faced with a problem, and we I have no idea. Let me figure out how to make this, and how do I make it fun? How do I make it something that everybody wants to play? And then, oh, by the way, I got to make it on time and on budget with the resources I have, and all these other things. And so we can't even work, in a perfect world ever. We're always kind of figuring out the best thing we can do with what we've got. And that's, one of the hardest things. Hi, Corey. Yes. Wow, you survived 12 years, man. You've got a heart of gold, or a little crazy, but that's a long time as a tester. And yes, I have a lot of respect for you guys. It's one of those jobs everybody thinks is easy, and it's just brutal. So I can't do the same thing like that every day. It's a really tough job, and you guys don't get a lot of credit for what you do. So definitely glad you were able to survive the chaos for so long. Planning, we do, a lot of kind of production level stuff, and we may not be necessarily scheduling our stuff. We may have a producer type person or somebody there who's gonna, help us, produce our stuff, but we're also, but we are very heavily involved in making sure again that our stuff can be done on time and on budget. We got to then start prototyping our ideas, after we've built them, and we do work in our tools to actually build something that's interactive, but this is where, it gets really tough. We do a lot of writing, and stories, and breaking that kind of stuff down, and and whether it's writing design documents to stories to any kind of documents. We just, most of us spend half our days or all of our days just writing lots and lots and lots of documents. We also need some art skills. We need to know visually kind of what we want and what we do. We don't have to be an artist necessarily. It helps, but you definitely need to know and have some skills. Definitely having some art skills definitely helps. Wow, congrats, Corey. Yeah, it helps with the resume to have the games of the year. It doesn't help you survive the job and the chaos any better, I guess. So, in technical skills, and Corey, we will talk at the end of this talk. Actually, our last slide's on QA and testing. So if you're still here with us, definitely feel free to ask questions and chime in on your experiences there. Technical skills. I think this is the biggest disconnect and the biggest problem, and that there's no answer within our industry, and that Some people believe that, a game designer really almost needs to be a programmer, like super highly technical. And then other people, it's really just about fun. And every team's a little different on what they want, what they need, what they expect in the technical skills of a game designer. And so, I don't think most game designers don't need to know C and C++, but they do need to be technical and understand, and have good math skills and, understand concepts and things like that, pretty well. Game engines. We talked about, what a game engine is and where, what it is. We talked about all the different kind of programs that you're going to use when you're, working. And we talked about, the challenge of implementing gameplay and just, a lot of what we do, we can write all day long on paper. But in the end, a lot of what we do, especially related to like how it feels and how it controls, like we just got to touch it. We got to like implement it and go like, okay, how's this going to work? When we're doing it this way. And you can't really put that on paper. We have to implement the gameplay, but then we also have to, when we're done implementing it, we got to iterate 1,000 times to really try to get it feeling right. And that's what's hard to quantify with a lot of people. And that, and there's a definitely a disconnect there with some people that just think implementation, is really fast and really easy. Like, oh, I can just throw a default character controller in, throw a default camera in, throw a default controller in, and boom, like 30 minutes or an hour later, like it's done, and really it's not. There's a lot of nuances, and I've been on projects where, even just the character controls, and all that, and the camera took several guys like a year to make. Like, these are not things you do in hours, to get it feeling right. So big AAA games really spend a lot of time to get it right of how you implement the gameplay and how you feel it. So last week we started talking about combat. I'm going to dive a little deeper in. I think that we kind of glazed over some of the challenges of combat last week, and I wanted to dive just a little bit deeper. This is not going to be a class on combat mechanics and how to design combat, because that could take another week or another 4 or 5 episodes or more just on that alone. But this idea, this nuance of like, how does combat work? And a lot of people, again, just like have this idea that like combat is just like, well, I've got guns, for example, is the most simple form of combat, and I'm gonna put a character in the game. I'm gonna give him a gun. I press a button and the gun shoots, and the other guy takes damage and dies, and that's the design of my combat system. And what they don't realize is that combat systems, even with just ranged guns, are so nuanced and so hard, and they're 1,000 times easier than, say, doing melee combat or something like that. But even then, you have to figure out, like, all these things. Like, I have different weapons, and how do all those different weapons work? I have, they all have different rates of fire. They all do different damage, different types of damage. Some might do a damage over time, or some might do something else. A shotgun is going to spray out, very wide, but not too long. A sniper rifle shoots very far, but, a single shot, right? So high accuracy, in range versus high accuracy or spread, throughout. I mean, there's lots of different types of guns. There's lots of different types of things. There's accuracy when I'm moving, and how accurate is that gun going to be as I'm trying to move? How fast can I target, an aim? Or, nuances like even in a sniper rifle, if I'm in a scope, I can only see so much, and people could be coming at me from the sides and I don't even see them. Like, that's a nuance you have to understand. Like, do I just look, can I see the scope here, but I can see my peripheral vision, or am I locked into only seeing my scope, right? Like, just that one little nuance, can change everything. And then you have things like your armor systems and your health systems, any kind of your damage systems. Like, how do I take damage? Is it instantly? Is it damage over time? Does it take, damage away from my armor first, or my shields, and then it hits my core body? Can my core body, health be can I heal myself? How do I heal myself? Is it heal over time? Does it heal when I'm away from enemies? Does it heal through a magic potion or a health pack? I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And like, all these things are really critical to a combat system. And so for a game designer, we've got to figure out all these nuances, right? We've got to go in there and figure out, like, okay, how do I get this one thing working? And that's just in the base systems, right? And now where combat gets even more complicated is now we might have, 10, 20, 100 enemies in a game. We might have one player character or many player characters, or many units even. If it's a real-time strategy game or something, we might have hundreds of units, and the enemy may have hundreds of units. And we've got to figure out, like, how is that all going to come together, right? We've got to figure out, then now that weapon and that stuff is now attached to something else, right? And so in and of itself now, there's also all the variances and nuances of, like, the skills and abilities and stuff of that unit, of that character. So the player character, as he levels up and he gets better, then the weapon might inherently get better as well. And so, the player may have skill trees and tech trees that allow him to use a weapon better. The weapon itself might be a certain class or a type, that the designer has to figure out, how does that level up? How does a weapon have its own XP? All these kinds of things. Even how much noise, a weapon uses, and does that trigger enemy AI? And so does certain guns have a lot more sound on them. That's why we use sound suppressors or other kinds of things. But then a sound suppressor, makes less noise, but it has, less accuracy and does less damage. At least if you go by real world, metaphors in the way that, real world sound suppressor, has its disadvantages as well. Otherwise, everybody would use it, all the time. And so, again, as a game, you don't necessarily have to be accurate, but you got to understand, like, what is fun, right? And where and why and how am I going to use this, and how's the world going to react to it? So now the enemy AI and stuff has to be figured into this whole factor. How are the guards on patrol going to factor into being attacked? The guards have a leader, and can that leader now inspire or call for reinforcements or do something else, in the AI, right? So there's a tremendous amount of strategy and tactics and balancing that goes into all of that. Now, the next layer of complication are the levels, which we're going to get into in the next slide. But to kind of foreshadow now and start talking about why this is even gets more crowded or more complicated, I should say, is that when we go to implement a level, now how and where is a player able to move, right? Does a player move through a level anywhere? Or a character, can he move anywhere, in the level? And how is that going to affect the combat? And so now the level, if it has, like, objects that might be a cover object, right? That I can duck behind and do something. I can do blind fire or do some kind of cover fire around it or something that's just, a little bit different. Like, does that exist? Or is it just a static object that I can move behind to block myself from the enemy, and then I can move out, shoot, move back, even if it's not an official cover object, something that's interactive, that doesn't mean it can't be used for cover. And so, as you get into designing your levels now, and you get designing the setups of the enemies, as a designer, you've got to be able to figure out, like, okay, I've got some area here, and the player might be contained within that area. He might have, in the most simple example, an entrance into an area and an exit out of an area, right? And the player's got to get from point A to point B. Now, that might sound really easy, but with, a dozen enemies, patrolling here and various things, depending on how strong I am, how powerful I am, I've got to figure out, like, well, how do I get across this thing? Do I kill everybody? Do I come in and stealth kill some guys? Do I just go in guns blazing and try to take everybody out? And every game could have its nuances. A stealth game could have a totally different set of mechanics than, a high action game, right? And that's where, the jobs of a level designer and a systems designer or a combat designer start to kind of overlap, and it gets really complicated because you've got to take into account, how is combat, working in the game. And how are these enemies, interacting in the game, right? How are the enemies or whatever it is, and it can get even more complicated. There could be NPCs that are helping me, that could be allies. Play some of the Call of Duty games or whatever, and there's times where I come out onto a street and and I start moving forward, and there's NPCs that are on my turn, and they're driving a tank or they're doing something, and I can follow them down the street, and they're shooting and providing cover fire for me and stuff. So now I'm kind of part of an army. I might have a full team of guys. This could be a game where I have 6 or 7 player characters under my control, or like a real-time strategy game, have an army of characters. And then, those all need to like, okay, well, where can these guys move, and what can they move through? Can they even move into this area, right? Can they do they move fast or slow through this thing? Can they go up and over a hill, or do they have to go around the hill? Can they go through a river, or do they have to take the bridge, right? And like all these things are these nuances in combat that really affect our level design. And so, as we get into thinking about and implementing levels, if your game has combat in it, the levels can be, can get incredibly complicated. The level design can get incredibly complicated because, all the enemies and stuff need to be able to understand the environment. They need to understand the levels. They need to understand how to use it. It needs to offer the player lots of different strategies and tactics. And the more open that level becomes, or that level design is, the harder it is, right? And so it's kind of one of those things where, as your level design if your level design is very linear, right? Take some of the most early levels, a Crash Bandicoot game or something like that. It's or Mario or whatever. It's pretty easy to kind of know, like, I'm coming here and there's going to be some enemies to fight, and then I move on, and so it's pretty straightforward. The player doesn't have an alternate path. But in level design, as soon as we start opening up the world and making a more open world or more sandboxy style game, the complication in game design is going to go up 10x or more. And how we build those levels, how we balance them, because now a single combat scenario with lots of guys around it, maybe the player can enter it here, but maybe he can come in here, maybe he can come in here, maybe he can fly his helicopter in and land, maybe you can call in an airstrike first, and then, and all these layers just start complicating, the design of a level and how the player progresses through it. And there's times and places where we want the player to be in an open world and kind of have at least the illusion that he can go anywhere, but not. And so again, as like a combat designer, your job is to figure out all these nuances, right? And you've got to figure out, like, how are you going to make the combat systems really fun, and you're dealing with a lot of theory, but then you also have to figure out and either yourself or working with a level designer, depending on what your job title is and your company structure and all that. Somebody also then has to implement the combat, in these levels, right? And that's no easy task. And so we'll come back to that, here in a minute, a little bit. But let's just talk about the job of a level designer. So this is probably, half the industry at some levels. I mean, I don't know that that's exact, but the job of a level designer is a really big job, especially for entry level, people that are coming in and out of college or something like that. The job of a level designer is definitely probably one of the biggest starting places for most game designers. And so as a level designer, there's a lot there to this job that, again, requires a lot of skill set. It requires a lot of different things. Now, you may not be implementing and designing the game systems, but you might be involved, depending on your team structure and your size and all that. The structure of the team might allow for the system designer and the level designer to be the same person, in your team, or they could be completely different things. And so you have to kind of figure out, again, as a level designer, what that job really entails, and and how much of the system stuff you need to implement, right? So let's talk about the job of a level designer, and kind of focus in on it if you want to be a level designer, which, again, I would say this has the highest chance of getting an entry-level job into game development. Being a systems designer, which we've been kind of talking about, especially in like combat design and things like that. Those jobs are the jobs of a level designer, is a very different job than a job of a system designer. And a system designer tends to be something that needs a little bit more skill and a little bit more knowledge to do, and is probably not the easiest job to get hired into. It doesn't mean you can't get hired into a system designer's job, day one, but it definitely is something that does take, some skill to do, and some experience. And so But as a level designer, I think the one of the biggest misconceptions, again, and part of the reason I even started this whole, 4-week now conversation about game design is that that a level designer has to do a lot more than just sit in Unreal and play and build things. And I've talked to a lot of people lately that really just thought like that the job was like this kind of, again, sort of easy thing, and that like I can go and just basically get Unreal, and they thought Unreal would be really easy to use. They thought it'd be the equivalent of Photoshop or something, just a tool you could pick up in a day or two, and then like know how to do everything in it. And they just thought that like the job of a level designer would just be like going in and watching, if you watch like the speedrun video, which we showed last week, of like, it's like very artistic, right? I can place some trees and I build some hills and, I put some enemies down and, it's really just fun, and I can just kind of have fun building this thing. It's like playing with Play-Doh or Legos, and, I can just build some stuff out, and they just thought that was the job. And, the reality is that's not the job, and that is part of the job, and it is the fun part of the job. But the reality is level design is really, really hard. It requires a lot of different skills. So first of all, when we talk about level design, you got to know what's in the level, and I've talked about this before, but you got to know, what is this thing going to be, right? A game, for example, might have 20 levels, and so the levels have to flow maybe, and I'll use the word, and I'm using the word level just to be clear here, is the more industry standard of like when we had a load screen and we'd load a level up and things like that, and we called it a level, and that was traditional. But the same concept, a level or a level designer also could work for areas of, say, an open world game. So, instead of the game being 20 distinct levels, it could be 20 distinct areas or grid areas or something within a bigger map that ultimately are all stitched together and work together. So just so you understand, like the idea of being a level designer, we don't necessarily have to use the term or use the analogy of a level, in total, it's an analogy these days for what the job does, meaning that we handle an area of the game and we build it, we build it out. So the question is, what are we building, right? What are we doing? Like what do we do in the game? And I think that's the hard question, right? Like what is going to go into this thing? And so the player, we'll use the most simple example today. So let's just imagine that there's 20 levels in a game, and they progress from levels 1 through 20 in a linear fashion, so that there's no branching, there's no open world, there's just something like that. Well, the job of a level designer, first of all, you got to figure out like, which level am I working on? Is this level 1? Is it level 50? Or in this case, 20? Which level am I building, right? And then what skills, what abilities, what features are in there? If it's especially in the first half of the game or something, there might be new things introduced. What new stuff is going to be in here? Like, this level is going to introduce double jump. This level is going to, introduce this new move, wall climb. And this level is going to introduce some new weapons and some new player skills. And like, what's that new stuff there? And do I need to teach it? Do I need a tutorial for it? And how do I introduce it? Because a tutorial should be more than just like popping a message up on screen saying press X to jump, right? You want to have, a jump, and then you want to generally reinforce everything so that there's a minimum of 2 or 3 times that the people do it. And so then you might want to say jump. Okay, jump again. Okay, jump again, and it's just reinforcing the learned behavior so that it becomes more muscle memory, right? And so, but you got to know like what is in the level, right? What are going to be the objectives of the level? What, is there quests? Is there storylines and things that I have to meet? Is there going to be, a certain terrain type that's going to be there? Do I need to, is this a snowy world? Is this a desert world? These are all things that we would create and design. When we talk about level design, we generally do this for me in a spreadsheet or in a Office Word document, in bullet points. And generally, I try to break it down against systemic, gameplay of trying to figure out like what is it that is going to go into this level, right? What is this thing that's going to make this level really fun, really great? What are all the things I need to incorporate? Which enemies are in the level? How big is the level? What's the time of day of the level? What's the weather like? All these things are questions you need to answer when you're implementing levels. And I'm not going into all this today. We'll if people are interested, we'll do another longer talk on how to actually implement and design a level. But you get the idea that when you're designing a level, you're still working in words. You're still working in concepts. You're thinking about mechanics, and you might have specific game or level mechanics that you need implemented either specifically for your level or something else. But this is that time where a lot of designers, when they're doing this level design, will come back and request like 20 new features. And they're like, oh, I need this, and I need that, and I need all these. I want a teleporter here, and I want all these new unique enemy and all this kind of stuff. And as a general rule, as a project lead or somebody that's kind of running these things, I will typically tell people like ask for 2 or 3 things, not 20. Or nothing new, and just figure out how to reuse what you've got. And figure out how to use the mechanics that are in the game. But again, it has to be this coordinated effort that you need to know how do you go from like a level 1 to level 20? How do you progress? And how does that the progression happen both in the story, but also in the game mechanics, right? And the systems and the enemy introductions, the foreshadowing. It's really deep and complicated stuff. And so, you need to kind of figure that out. And if you guys haven't seen and aren't aware of it, on gamasutra.com, I wrote an article. You can search for my name on Gamasutra called The Hero's Journey in Games. And there's a long article there that talks about how to do exactly what I'm talking about. And I did write this article a number of years ago, but it's still pretty relevant. And it basically tells you like how to break down all your levels and how to kind of progress them, how to make them fit into a storyline, like a 9-act or 3-act story structure, how to utilize the hero's journey in games, which was written by Joseph Campbell, and how to take that story and the concepts of a hero's journey and apply it into level design. And so you understand like what needs to go into these things to make these stories progress, and how's that tie to level design and what a specific level does. And so this level design stage that we're talking about, this first thing that you do when you're designing levels, is a lot more complicated than you realize, because it's not only just designing a single level, but you gotta design all these things, in totality, across, their thing. And that's what's really hard about level design is it's, you need a creative director or somebody or a lead level designer, whoever that is, that's helping you oversee the total vision, the arc across all your levels. And then you have to understand, where does your level fit into all of that? There's a little bit of advice too on the side. Inevitably, I don't know that I've ever worked on a project that all of our levels made it in the game. We always run into problems because, again, part of the process that's important to understand here is that quite often, as a level designer, we often are the last ones that get to work. We're kind of like that snowball starts rolling down the hill as the game gets started, and we're waiting at the bottom to kind of catch it so we can take it and run with it. But sometimes the snowball goes really slow, and while we might think we have 6 months to implement a level, quite often we get 6 weeks, and all the best laid plans, go out the door. And so one of those things I've learned to do, in the beginning of this whole process is that, when you're designing that overarching structure for your all of your levels, be aware that, you are going to probably, I would say there's a 99% chance you're going to make cuts. And that you're going to run out of time, resources, or have problems, that ultimately some levels are going to get cut. Well, if every level is important, if every level has important stories and important progression, like new mechanics that are being introduced and tutorials and all these kinds of things, then as soon as you got to cut some levels, it means you have to rework everything. Because then you're like, oh, well, that story doesn't make any sense anymore because I just cut out, a level where that story where the main bad guy maybe was, introduced. And now you can't just have him pop in and show up the next level. You need to reintroduce him. And so now you got to go back and redesign that level. And so it gets really complicated, right? And so, so that's the kind of thing you need to be aware of. In that, that if you design everything at 100%, capacity, you're going to have some trouble. And so what I recommend doing is I design 25% of my levels to be cut with zero effort. Meaning, if a producer or an executive comes to me and says, we got to ship the game sooner, or we got to, X, Y, or Z, we've got problems, cut some levels. I have 25% of my levels that are like, sure, boom, gone. So, if there's 20 levels in the game, 5 are designed to be instantly cut with absolutely zero ramifications. And I designed those up front to be easily cuttable. So, they might have stories and stuff, but they're going to have subplots and things that are irrelevant to the rest of the game. So that, they have no mechanics that are introduced. They have nothing new that's introduced, and therefore can be easily cut. Then I take the next 25%, and I make those very easily cut. And so I try to minimize, the things in them, and I try to create isolated, mechanics or story or whatever that can be easily transported, in a more modular way over to another area, another place, if I really needed to as well, or some way to do those levels a little bit faster. Then, when I'm scheduling the whole thing, another thing to understand is that you'll do your best levels really after you've done one. So as a level designer, that first time we implement a level is it's really, tough. We're still figuring things out. We don't know really what's fun. We haven't figured out the flow and everything else there. And so the very first levels that we actually design are usually some of the worst, in the game. And so, I don't like to just start with level 1 and, let's just say we have, 5 level designers, again, 20 levels. So we're each going to basically, in theory, do 4 levels. If I do my first level, as level 1, it's not going to be that great. And you really need level 1 to be great. So what I'll actually start out, my first level I'll actually build is level 5. And then I will build level 5 first. Then I will build level 1. And then I'll go back and build, level 11, and then kind of go back and do the last thing. So I designed a section of the game or levels, and it doesn't have to be in solid blocks, but I design, the second level I build is usually level 1, if I'm doing something, and then we try to, make sure that that there's enough time that I can spend enough time on that first level, those first 5 levels, to really make them amazing. But if push comes to shove, I can cut some levels later on. That's important too. So again, there's just, lots of ways to think about the structure of the level design. And that's a crazy part of our job, is trying to figure out all the structure and all these things and how these moving components are coming together. And so the skills that we're using here are kind of part system designer, part, again, like level designer and what is fun within a level and within a world. We've got to be kind of part artist. We've got to be technical. We got to know how to build this thing in the first place and stuff like that. So this job as a level designer is really, really, really multifaceted, and we're doing and using a lot of different skills. And even beyond that, we've got to be thinking about how do we, add in the visuals? How do we add in make it, the time of day, and, make all that happen, and make cool effects, and make it atmospheric, and, and put in weather and all sorts of stuff also that just kind of layer upon layer upon layer of depth. The noises and the sounds and the ambiance, also are part of this. We can't forget how important audio is in level design, and so there's just so many little things, especially if you're going to get in, make a horror game or something like that. Ambiance is everything, and you got to really figure that part out, because that can definitely be, a huge challenge. Hi, Manic Top. Glad you could finally make it live in person. So once we have, kind of the base on paper in words, level design, then we're going to move into designing maps. And so the first thing I'll do is create a flowchart. And I'm going to just pull up here some stuff really quick to kind of show you guys. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to really go in and find the perfect examples. Let's see if I can. So sorry, I wish I had a little bit more time here to pull this up. You guys, this probably is too small for you to read. But if you do some Googling on flow charts and things like that, that was more of a UI screen, not a level. So I apologize. I should have found some better examples here. But the idea is that when you're designing a flow chart, these are more traditional flowcharts. And this is, if you think about a traditional flowchart, there can be different types of things. There can be the start, there can be the finish. Again, if it's a fairly linear level, this could account for branching as well. But again, you come down to a thing, and then there's something happens, right? So this could be, the first box could be, first fight. The second box could be second fight. The third box could be a boss fight. The fourth box could be, a village where I get to now sell all the loot that I just made, that I just picked up from those last ones. And then there could be decision trees, like, did I do this or yes or no? Okay. And then maybe it branches and goes somewhere. So I can literally flow chart out my level once I kind of get an understanding of where it is. Now, what I like to do in my process is that these things initially are kind of conceptualized as a flow, right? These things are conceptualized in how the player would move through a level. If you can conceptualize that, again, as it gets more open world and more sandboxy, that gets a little bit trickier to visualize here. But you still want to be able to visualize how's the player going to move and which things are happening there. And then what I'll do is I'll take the same kind of flow chart, and then what I'll kind of do is I'll draw a rough map of what I kind of think the level is going to look like in its shape. And this is very rough and can be changed a million times, but I'll put kind of like, here's the map, sort of that I'm envisioning. And then I imagine that each one of these things really, because these events, which each one of these flowchart things is an event, right? Maybe it's a battle, maybe it's some kind of a puzzle or whatever that is. Each one of these things can represent a different thing, right? The shapes and the colors can all represent different things. And so you got a sense of where it's flowing, but it doesn't give you any relational space, considerations. And so one of the things I like to do now is take the same flow chart and I start moving things around on a map. So I might put the start up here. It says, start in the city, right? And then I'm going to, put the next box that says, fight 1 here. And then the next, thing or over here, let's say fight 2. And then here's the boss fight, way up here. And so now, even though the flow is the same, the arrows are the same and stuff, I know like, oh wait, this thing's, this one's going to flow over to here, which is going to go over to here, which is going to go to here, right? And so I start to kind of position things, and then I'll start even scaling some of the boxes, to maybe be a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, to give me some sense of size, space, and spatial relationships to each other. And so I'm figuring out like how that all works as a level designer, right? And this is a precursor to a 2D map. And so then the next step after that would be to kind of take that rough flow chart, and now, whether I'm going to sketch it, or whether I'm going to do it, kind of like a flow chart, and I can just have a bunch of symbols and topography. You don't have to be a level designer, to, let me try to show up here. You don't have to be, say, an artist to do that. Trying to see if I could see like a good example here of even just rough. I mean, this one's, 2D, it's on a side, for a side scroller, but idea, again, very rough, things that, pretty much anybody should be able to draw these out, especially like, side and top down view type maps. You don't have to be, a brilliant artist to do these things. I'm looking for, so again, you could, so he'd be, more of even a 2D top down. I think this is actually a rendering of something, but again, it can be something that really, really simple for you to draw in Photoshop or draw in another application. And yeah, this is more of an in-game map, but again, conceptually, these things should not have to be all that hard to draw out. I mean, even some of these are just, really, really simple, art, right? And, so again, you don't have to be a crazy artist to do these maps, but you do need to understand why are they fun? Why are they interesting? And then, in some cases, so here's actually a good example. So here's an enter. If you guys can see this, okay. And then you're going to enter here, and they've got a bunch of S's or swarmers. So swarmers are a really small enemy. M is a melee enemy, which, does, like a sword based or punch or something kind of attack. And then R is a ranged enemy. And so you can see here that they're just doing really simple setups. There's 3 swarmers here. There's 4 here, and little arrows even showing like where they're going to move to, right? And, And then there's some melee guys, a couple melees, more swarmers, a few range guys, and off to an exit. So again, graph paper, super simple, doesn't have to be like too crazy, right? So anybody can do this. Anybody can draw this, right? And that's the point. Is you don't need to be an artist to be there, but you need to be able to have enough sense of spatial awareness as a level designer, right, to get in there and draw these maps. So once you kind of have hit that standpoint, it's time to move on to a white box. Now, something to be aware of too is that the spatial awareness when you're drawing out a 2D map can be really tricky because, again, 2D is 2D, right? And so in many cases, let's say we're doing a top-down map, right? And we're looking at things here. Well, these days we build a lot of 3D games. Well, a lot of 3D games might be really built on a 2D plane, right? And so your gameplay space may be perfectly flat, or it might have, say, hills, but the hills go up. Sorry, I'll put on camera a bit better. So you could have a flat plane here, but then you might have a hill up here, and it really is, just... maybe there's a cliff, or maybe there's, a way down, either way, it could be a rounded hill, whatever that is, but really it's just a single 2D thing versus having two areas like this where there was a bridge or something that was crossing over, and now I have multiple layers, could be 2 or 3 layers. Like imagine a big tower, that I've got like a path that goes around like this. Well, if you have a top-down map, and this thing might just look like a square here, but in reality, this thing could be 10 stories tall and have all this other layers of gameplay there. So how do you represent that on a 2D map? And now you can do some layering, in 2D maps, but that's where you got to start being a little bit creative and look for ideas of like, how do you layer in 3D? So in some cases, it's better just to jump into 3D as fast as you can. And that's what we call a white box. So let's talk about white boxing here. So the white boxes, can be done in Unreal or they can be done, in any kind of an art program. If you don't have a game engine that's up and running. So if you're working at a developer that's not using the Unreal Engine or Unity or something like that, and you're kind of stuck and you're waiting, these kinds of things, could be blocked out in another program. And so don't feel like you have to absolutely block these out in 3D in your game engine. Again, you could use 3D Studio, you could use Maya. There's lots and lots and lots of tools that do 3D, really simple stuff. They could be as simple as just, a series of boxes and shapes. You don't have to do something that has super elaborate stuff. And so quite often, I will put things in just plain geometric shapes to start with, and then you start refining it and refining it and refining it. And if you look at like some of these pictures, I mean, this is really just a bunch of geometric cubes. And then in some cases, there's more cubes stacked on each other, and they've created really basic stuff with some other, really basic things. And so pictures like this, and white boxes like that, are, these things should be really, really fast, really easy to do. And so if you've never heard of white boxing or never looked into it, again, the idea would be that, you can do these things very quickly. You can iterate on them, and then hopefully in the best case scenario, you get, so like here's even like a whole city just kind of mocked up with, again, simple geometric shapes. And I'll show you one last example here. Oh, shoot, it's small. Let's see. See if I can. No, not the biggest picture there. So if you guys are able to see this here, but this was an example from Uncharted, that kind of showed, again, this was kind of a final white box where they took and made a lot of playable area. So these colored surfaces are interactive for them. The green is a climbable surface. And then I believe white was a different kind of surface. So you could kind of see there was different climbable surfaces here and things like that. So they would keep refining the shapes more and more and more as they went to kind of get a better sense for it. And then eventually these shapes would be handed over to an artist who would probably build the shapes out or rough it out. There's a lot of different pipelines and processes there. But again, the white boxing, process and what we do is a really big part of really understanding, how to make a level. And, the point is to do it really fast. And what you're doing is you're building spatial awareness. You're trying to be able to, you want to try to get into the game engine as fast as you can, with the game camera, and hopefully with your game character as much as you can, because you want to be able to look up and look around and look down and see what you can see, because on paper you're only going to get so far, and you're not going to understand how big spaces are. You're thinking about scale and size, and do I see something really big off in the distance? We often call them weenies. Weenie is a term that Disney coined, and you think about these as a tall tower or a tall mountain or something. We might be in kind of a town or a forest or something. There's stuff that's kind of, maybe it's 25 yards, 50 yards, 100 yards away, but it kind of blocks our view a little bit. So we have some foresight in front of us and then kind of a little bit of lower blockage here. But then we want to often have something even bigger, back here. There could be a tower, it could be a mountain, it could be a sun, whatever it is. But these things are really important because they help with navigation. And so one of the things that in a 3D world that players often do is we often get lost. And so the white boxing phase is there to help understand, can I get through this world without having to look at my map every 5 seconds? Do I have to watch a mini map to know, am I orientating north and south, and where am I going? And so a lot of the job of a level designer is really figuring out that spatial awareness, right? And really figuring out okay, can I navigate just through my own visuals? Can I kind of lure the player hey, you got to get to the dark tower and destroy it? Well, if I see the dark towers off here in the distance, then I sort of know I got to go in that general direction. Now the paths may not lead that way. The paths may lead off this way and then off that way. But then when I can, it's nope, swing back around. And I look back around and I know that tower is off in the north. And I can always go back that way. I can always reorientate myself visually without having to look at a map. And so weenies serve a lot of purpose for orientation, for navigation, for reminding players of what they're supposed to be doing, all sorts of things. So if you're not familiar with the concept of a weenie, Google it. You can look up what the Disney weenies are all about. They did a really great job at the Disney theme parks and just in general about understanding how that works. As an aside, too, if you've never looked at theme park design, a lot of what we do in level design is both very heavily based in architecture and really heavily based in theme park design. And again, it has to be fun. But there's a lot of tricks that we're using, about how people flow through a level, how people orientate through a level. And we won't get into it in this talk because this is more about level design. But it really is about how do you even the color, if you look at, a lot of games, the area that you're in has its own, style, has its own color palettes, has its own thing. So I even know, ooh, okay, I'm in the pirate area right now, and now I'm over into the rich people's area, and now I'm over into the slums, and, and each one of those has a very different artistic look, so that even the player, as he runs and moves through a world, knows, oh, I'm over here now. Oh, I'm over here now, right? There's so many nuances to this level design. It's crazy. And so you have to be, asking yourself 1,000 different things. And then it can get even worse if you're building more photorealistic levels. One of our mentors, Andres, he's works at Ubisoft, and then you see the stuff that he does, and he's just got these mountains, and he's trying to build these natural things he worked on Far Cry. He was the lead level designer on Far Cry 6. And an amazing guy. He's got this background in architecture and all these things, but he's figuring out how do the mountains form and how the river's going to come down through a mountain, and trying to make that all visually look realistic. So the more realistic your levels get, the more you have to even be thinking about how would this go here, and how would there be a trail and a path and a road here, and how is that going to cut into the mountains and stuff. And it just gets really, really crazy. And that's what your white boxing is kind of trying to figure out, where am I going to go? How am I going to get there? What makes sense? How big it is and that kind of stuff. And you're figuring out a lot of those things. And then you might start layering in things like enemies and stuff. Now, they don't have to necessarily even be functional, but your first thing might just be a bunch of red cylinders that are like your enemies. You got a sense of oh, okay, as I'm moving through the world, here's where some enemies are going to spawn. And, and here's a car maybe that I'm going to pick up and drive. And you start layering in again, some interesting stuff, that way. But again, that's, a lot of that's that level flow, and just how I'm going to move through that level, is really an important part of the job. Next is the hardest part about being kind of a level designer is that, again, this is where it gets technical. The level, now I'll say hardest, for those of you that are maybe a programmer, this might be the easiest. But for the average designer who is not a programmer, who's not super technical, scripting your levels and doing all the technical stuff in it, can be some of the hardest things. And so, you have to figure out, like, okay, I've got lots of scripts. Like, the most common would be a location script. A lot of these things will be set off triggers. And the triggers are something that, are invisible to the player. But if the player character steps into it, to a region, then it runs the script. That script could spawn an enemy. The script could cause an explosion or a cutscene, any of these kinds of things. So there's lots of stuff that can go on there. And then the scripts could also be like a look at. So I might have to be standing in a certain location and the camera has to be like on something, and then it might happen. So that way I don't trigger like an explosion or something cool until I know the player's looking at it, and I don't want him to be like looking over here and then have the explosion go off and he misses it, so there's those kinds of things. So it's just lots and lots and lots of things there for, to implement into a level. But most of the scripts come into like your enemies, your enemy behaviors, your enemy paths, your enemy spawning, and what your enemies are going to do in their attacks. Do they attack in waves? Do they rush the player? How the AI is going to work in the enemies and stuff like that, or other NPCs in the level. So that side of things is some of the most, some of the hardest to work on. So, enemies, enemy placement, NPCs, even get into like just a lot of edge cases. Like, one of the examples is like in WoW, there's a dragon and they have what's called a lot of enemies often have what they call a leash. And so they may start off and they spawn in a certain location. And then if the player comes up and attacks them, that enemy might move a certain distance towards the player. And if the player tries to run away, the enemy will chase it. The player runs away, the enemy chases it. But the enemy might be able, at some point, stop and then return back either to where he started from or return back some distance. Things like that. And there's lots and lots and lots of edge cases around stuff like that. Or, does an enemy, return all the way back home, or does he move a little bit farther? And people can like sometimes lure things through the world and put them into places that they, shouldn't be, and then like how do NPCs, different enemies or NPCs interact with each other? Do they fight each other? All that kind of stuff. The AI and all the nuances there, get kind of onto the AI programming side, but the level designer gets very deeply involved in all of those systems and how they're set up. And so, again, depending on the job, it's going to depend. It's going to depend on what your skill set needs to be there. Another thing that we often have to do as level designers, once we have all it blocked out and built, we often need to adjust our collision. So the collision is what the player is going to run into or an NPC is going to run into, and we might have separate collisions for the NPC and the player. So we might need to have certain collision tagged for NPC only, some for the player, meaning there might be certain things that say keep an NPC out of an area because we don't want him to go there. We don't want him to get stuck, or we don't want him to like fall off a cliff or do something stupid. So we'll put up something that stops an NPC. Sometimes it's for the player. And we can't just use the world geometry all the time because the world geometry often is too complicated and often allows us to get into cracks and crevices or do stupid things with it. And so quite often we need to smooth that collision out. So we often will have a lot of additional collision that's simplified. And we're often putting that in there. The level artist might help us with that job, but a lot of times it's, again, the designer kind of looking into space and kind of going like, yeah, we better keep him out of there. And we're basically putting up invisible fences, but we don't want them to be too obvious, but we do want to often stop players from, doing things and getting in trouble, right? Yes. So Corey, thanks. Yeah. The nav mesh as well as part of that, which is related, and the nav mesh is quite often related to, if you're using a simple like movement algorithm like A-star or something like that, it will generate a top-down mesh where the AI basically is allowed to go, or where the player is allowed to go, and it'll have a bunch of legal, illegal, or other types of a little, usually break it down into a bunch of little squares, and you kind of can see like exactly where everything can move to. That's another thing, but that's usually the nav mesh is usually related to an AI. Whereas the collision is generally related to direct input or direct control of something. But both of those, again, are there to help the AI, the player character, and the NPCs, and anything that moves in the game not do stupid things. And so it just depends on the type of game you're building and stuff of how much you need to do there as a designer. But that is something that is one of those like polishing tasks that sometimes drives us crazy, because we often are fixing these things through bugs, and I mean, I remember like Munch's Odyssey, we had bugs where like a player would run and jump off a cliff and die, and at the time Microsoft didn't allow us to, the player couldn't ever like purposely kill himself. And then we had to like figure out like, okay, well, what happens if he jumps off the cliff? Do we have a death plane down below that like if he drops a little bit, he just dies, or whatever? And so we ended up putting up a separate collision right at the edge of the cliff, so that basically the player would hit the edge of the cliff and stop and couldn't actually jump off the cliff, just things like that. So like we're always like finding these weird solutions, for things. All right. So a big part of what we do as level designers, and again, depends on the game. So not every game has a story, right? And not every game has quests and missions and things like that. But talking about the types of games that we do, which is the most common type of game that has levels and those kind of things, the more common than not, thing is that, again, we often have an overarching story for our whole game. We often have an overarching story for our whole level. And then within a level, we've got maybe little sub-stories and things that are going on, and we've got to figure that out. And we may not as level designers be writing those stories exactly, but quite often we're very heavily involved in at least outlining what they are, trying to figure out what they are. We may have a writer on the team or a creative director or somebody who's helping us, figure all that out. But at some point, somebody's got to figure out like what are all these things, right? And your high level executive, creative director type people will probably give you broad strokes of what you want to do. And it's up to you to figure out how to implement it, right? And so that means, like, what's the specific quest? What's the specific story that's going to go here? What's that specific conversation all about? And you may just outline what is there, and then you probably will have a writer or somebody come along and help you. But there is a job called quest designer, and the quest designer, is a job that's more common at bigger teams. Companies like Blizzard on World of Warcraft or things like that will have a specific job called a quest designer, and they're a subset of the level designers. But quite often those quest designers are really good writers as well, and that's the one kind of skill set where they differ from a traditional level designer. And a traditional level designer may not be required to be a great writer. Whereas like a quest designer might be somebody who actually is really like a level designer with great writing skills. And whether those have been officially, where they went to school for that, or whether it's just they're a good writer, it's hard to say. And again, quite often, even for myself, like I may go in, I'm a pretty good writer, but I may still not have the time to go in and polish all my writing. So I may do a first pass of all my stuff, and then I may have a writer come in and help me at the end, polish all the dialogue, polish all the choices, and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of processes and ways of how levels are implemented. But keep in mind that, depending on the game, you're going to potentially have conversations and conversation dialogue trees and all sorts of stuff that you're going to have to figure out and probably implement. And those aren't super hard to implement, but as you get more and more and more branching and it gets all over the place, it can get really messy. And then you have to be able to do things that, you're going to implement, stuff that's going to happen, and triggers and stuff that are going to happen, based on that. And so, so that can get complicated. We'll get to that just in a second when we talk about quests. And then, we might get into like having to do cutscenes and stuff. And yes, we may have an art team who's helping us, but we may have a lot of little cutscenes and things that we do ourselves, little interactive. And when I'm talking about cutscenes here, I'm not talking about triggering an interactive pre-rendered movie, that's just kind of like the game pauses and it plays some fancy cinematic and then, comes back into the, main game. I'm talking about, in-game cutscenes and things like that. So quite often as a level designer, I'm setting up really basic kind of stories again and events, and those don't necessarily have to have any words, right? A story doesn't have to have words. A story is like what's happening and how does this progress, what the player needs to know. And so this could be as simple as like take a really simple common analogy. Like I need to foreshadow that a bunch of enemies are being spawned, right? And so it might be the kind of thing where I come into a certain area and now we basically do a trigger. I go into a volume, from the top down thing. I walk into this volume. We take away all player controls. We now cut the camera off to, say, the far side of the valley, and now the camera cuts in here, and now we see a bunch of enemies spawning and running out of a door and yelling at each other, and then now, the camera cuts back to the player. We give the player back his control. That cutscene took a few seconds, but it foreshadowed that, some enemies just ran into the valley and you better look out and you better be prepared, right? So that would be an example of like a cutscene that a designer would do all by himself. He needs to know a little bit about cameras. He needs to know a little bit about motion and triggering these things, how to set up enemies along a path, and then basically spawn the enemies and have them come in on the path, and then set up the whole AI and the combat sequence that's now going to ensue off of that. But that little cutscene there, again, took a designer to trigger all that, to set it all up. And again, depending on the complexity of it, the designer might have to be like coming in and like doing a cool camera and panning across here, as he's doing it, and then zoom in there, and and then these things got to cut in, and maybe it's got to, something's going to fly in and trigger an explosion, and all these kinds of things are stuff that as a level designer gets a little bit more skill set. You can do a lot of these things. Now, again, you might have an artist there who's going to help you come in and polish some of that stuff. But, on the vast majority of games that I've worked on, I could do all that stuff myself, and I could kind of set all that stuff up myself. But again, you need a little bit of artistic skill, right? A little bit of, and I use that word artistic very broadly, right? And like how and the types of skills you need to have as a level designer there. And then triggering other types of events or other things, again, like spawns and other types of stuff that would happen. Maybe I have to come into a scene, and then, an avalanche is going to come down behind me and block the path that I just came down. And so I might, again, have a cutscene there, and be able to flip the camera around, some event plays, the avalanche happens, I'm now trapped, and now I have to move forward, or something else, happens, or one of my, a sniper shoots and kills one of my guys, or something like that, and I have a whole cutscene around that, but an event that's happening. But really the bulk of our time is spent in the level design itself, the white boxing, and just building the level, itself in art. And then a lot of it is the building out the quests and the missions and what are we going to do in the game. And these get really tricky because not only have to figure out what they are, but for example, with quests, when I first start, and let's say the player has a system where I can go in and I can accept a quest and I can take on a quest, and it goes into my quest dialogue, so that I can complete it. Well, we would never want a state where that quest couldn't be completed. And so let's just say that the quest was to kill something really simple. I have to kill 4 enemies, right? 4, black wolves, something super, super, super rudimentary. But so the player accepts the quest and he says, okay, I've got 4, I need to kill 4 black wolves. And the quest might even tell them they're in this area, right? Something just really simple. But what happens if there's only 3 wolves there? Like the player can't literally physically complete the quest now, because maybe he went off ahead of time and killed one of the wolves and came back and then accepted the quest, and now that wolf was dead and didn't respawn, now what happens, right? And so now I just took on a quest that it was unachievable, and therefore I'm now stuck. And literally maybe I couldn't progress the game, or there's a quest there that I can't complete. And so part of like the challenges of setting up quests and missions and things like that, and things to do are, you got to be constantly checking, like, can the player do this? What has the player done? Okay, I've got two out of 4 wolves. What are those things that are going to happen? And then along the state, along the route, there's generally like other events and things that are happening. So as I progress through the game, there could be stuff that's specific to that quest that's even going to happen. Like, some special character might show up, or some other event may happen. Or as soon as I kill the 4 wolves, maybe a dragon is going to actually script, and the player doesn't know this, but, he kills the 4 wolves, which were the friends of the dragon, and now the dragon shows up, and the dragon's going to now fight me because he's pissed off that I just killed his dinner or something, or his friends, and, whatever that is. But again, all these things are things that have to be scripted and thought out and checked and made sure, that's there. And there's a lot of like rigorous tedium here that you have to go through as a level designer. I'm going to add this here just so that, because I hadn't actually put that on, is one of the things. So lastly, I want to talk about real quick about building the actual level. So going from a white box to actually building the physical level. Now, in some games, the art objects might be more Lego brick. So it could be modular art assets and things like that. So the art team might go and build out a whole bunch of modular pieces, and then basically, it's like Legos, and then they hand them to you as a designer and say, "Here, go build your level." And the designer just goes plop, 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 and they put them all down, and maybe that's all that's done, or they put them down, and then maybe an artist comes back and polishes them afterwards, whatever. But there's a lot of different art pipelines and level design pipelines that every team's a little bit different. You need to be aware of that sometimes you're going to need the art skills of like, okay, if I have Lego bricks, of things, especially as it gets more photorealistic, more photorealistic it gets, the harder it gets. And so that's one of those things where it can get really challenging, and that you don't know who's going to build the actual level and who's going to do the art polish on it. And you got to really figure that out ahead of time. So know like, okay, maybe I white box it, then an artist comes back and does, a bunch of work on it, but now I got to go back and put all the gameplay in it. Then an artist has to come back and polish it again. Or how's that whole pipeline and process going to work? Because this whole building it is a very iterative process that requires usually 2 or more team members. There's usually going to be yourself as a level designer, and there's usually a level artist. And sometimes you're working in a pod in a small group that's going to work really tightly together. Sometimes you don't. But that's something that's really important to understand on the implementation side is, again, every team's a little bit different. And that pipeline and process between level designer and level artist, who's building the final art, and who's implementing it, and then who's making it look pretty, and then who's polishing it, and that stuff all has to be kind of figured out. And then somewhere in there's all the technical problems and everything else that go along with it. So, very long-winded story about how to implement levels, and the design there. But I wanted to make sure that people understood, because I think that's something that there's been a lot of misconceptions about. I'm going to talk briefly about interface design, because again, level designers quite often get involved in the interface design of the game, and this could be, less needed on a PC console, say shooter, but if you get into like a simulation game or you get into a mobile game, some of these games are all about the interface design. I was going to bring up, some of my portfolio work here to kind of show you guys, and so I'm just going to kind of jump into some of my projects here, and just kind of show you guys really, really quickly that, whether you're doing, a really simple in-game interface design or something like that, you might have an interface designer on your team. You might have what they call a UX designer. You might have a UI designer. You might have those different people, but you generally still need a game designer to interface with those people. The game designer, you need to be kind of constantly going back and forth, because the features that are in a game, can be, might need to be shifted or tweaked, or how we implement something based on what the interface is capable of doing. And quite often my game designs get wrecked because the UX designer or somebody else is like, oh, we can't do that, or the interface programmer is like, oh, we can't do that. And so all these things are really linked together, and it's really hard to separate out, the UX design and the game design, and just the interface design in general, with it. But generally, if you, again, this might be a system designer's job. It might be part of a level designer's job, but not as much, but usually this is a system designer, and then usually, interface designer of some kind. But again, as a game designer, I am generally very, very, very involved in my interface designs, and it's something that is an important skill set to remember. And that might start with flow charting out, the interface, and knowing, how is the interface, going to flow, and it's a little bit blurry there. What's the flow of the interface? And then it starts off, you can see here was the rough initial version I did, and then here was the final implementation in CNC3, of how it looked. So doing lots and lots of interface design, again, there's kind of an artistic side of understanding, if you're an artist, of like, how is this going to look? But it's also, how is it going to function? And mobile games and stuff especially have a lot more interface designs. But you can see, especially early on, a lot of the interface can be really, really simple. It just can be blocks. You don't have to, again, be an artist, to do great interface design. But you're figuring out, what are all the different menus, what are all the different options, what are all the gameplay, and things that are gonna go into those interfaces, and you're gonna figure out kind of just, again, how it's gonna progressively get better and better, and like what's the player and the user's experience is what's the most important thing. And you may rough out things, on on an app using some like Figma or something, or you can make even just a rough prototype. So we talk about like white boxing and level design. Well, you can do kind of the equivalent. If you can do rapid prototyping. I use Figma or the Adobe XD programs predominantly, and with those, I can actually create interactive mock-ups that allow me to, like in this case, it was a mobile game, and I could touch all the buttons and things like this. This was just a screenshot of the game. I actually didn't have the game running there, but what I was trying to do was I was trying to see like how big are the buttons, what's my flow, is the text readable, stuff like that. So there was a lot of those kinds of dynamics that I wanted to see was, how many button presses did it take me to get someplace? How hard was it for me to get there? And again, you can rapidly prototype these things in Figma or XD or something, and that would be very useful to you. But you can see just there's tons and tons of stuff. This game, super simple UI. There was very very little to it. Other games a little bit more complicated. And then, the levels can be, UI can be very, very simple, to very colorful, and more complex. So it really just depends on, the kind of game that you're building. But again, you need to be figuring out, your game design. So especially on a lot of the, like in Roller Coaster Tycoon, when I did the UI design for that, like a lot of it was trying to figure out the nuances of, like, how do I work with these 3D objects in the game and build a roller coaster? So that was kind of game design, right? That the game was a simulation. The game was, was dealing with that kind of stuff, and that's it was really tricky to kind of figure out again, like what is this thing? What is it? How does it function? And is this the user experience? And what is the flow? And so anyhow, but again, some games have fairly deep user experiences and flow, and other ones don't. But you can, again, one last example here is you can see that, there is a lot of, you can do a lot of UI interface work. Like this was all done in Adobe Illustrator. And I just do basic stuff in Illustrator or Photoshop. I prefer Illustrator because it's more vector based. But this is, quite often where I'll start is a basic Illustrator file. And then often I'll import that into, into Figma or XD. And get everything kind of working there, whether it's just with a mouse or whether it's with my touch or whatever. And in some cases, if it's a mobile game, I'll use those platforms and actually get it up and running on my mobile phone and, and be testing it on my mobile phone, because I find that people that design, UIs on really big screens, it gets, it's problematic, and a lot of stuff is not very readable. All right. Question from, excuse me if I botch your name, Svinzon. So I know I completely botched your name, so I apologize for that. So do you have a resource how to construct an interface? Me and a friend have to make a settings, preferences, GUI window with a lot of different features, and we're getting lost of the outlook we want. So are you talking about the visual look, or are you talking about how it's flowing and actually getting it up and working? Again, like I typically will use either Adobe XD or Figma. Adobe XD is a little bit more complicated, and it works really well with Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Illustrator. And that's its one advantage, is that if you're using the Adobe suite, XD works really well with that suite all integrated, and then it can even read in like layers of your Photoshop file and stuff like that. So XD can be something like that that's very easy to work in. Although like on my current project, one of my projects right now, I'm using Figma, and I'm doing all the design work in Figma, and I can again make it all interactive. And so, hi Corey. So are you talking about the casino industry patent? I'm not sure what that refers to. Yeah. So as far as like your user friendliness, which is often the UX. Right, so if you're not familiar with interface UX or user experience, right, that's how friendly and how user friendly the game can be, the interface can be. so UX is its own like job. It's its own thing, and you can do a lot of, learning about UX. Like that's a whole, like, not even just a single talk. That's a conversation that could take, days and weeks to happen as far as how to make a game UI, UX very, more user friendly. But really it's about, again, I start with, very simple shapes. I start with, looking for like, what are all the features again, starting with a lot of like, wireframe flows and things to understand everything. If it's core to the loop of the game, if this is something the player is going to do over and over and over again, you want to make sure that the player can do it very easily. And so you want to make sure that it doesn't take too many mouse clicks or too many button presses or whatever on the screen, to do the same thing. If I have to do it 1,000 times a day, it's got to be really simple and really easy to do. And that's part of that effectiveness of, so by starting with the flow chart of it, that helps a lot. And then having common, UI and UX, practices. So for example, you'll notice that like, the X on the corner, things like that to close the windows. Using common analogies is another way to make sure that the game is really usable and make sure that people understand. You don't want to have to learn everything from scratch. You want to be able to have them understand, what common things are. So for example, let's just say that these 5 buttons here, that I wanted to have several pages of those, right? That's what this is showing here. Like these have arrows, that were showing like page, where I could page left and right. And then, if I was all the way, if I was all the way, say, to the left, then this button may disappear because there is no more to the left. Just little common conventions like that really help a lot. But it's really hard to give you like a solid, like, hey, this is exactly the way it goes. So you say, is there a mouse and button rule? Like never exceed X clicks to achieve it. Not a hard rule. I would say anything more than 3. If it's a common thing that I use a lot, I try not to have more than 2 or 3 clicks away, or more than 2 or 3 clicks to implement. If you get more than that, that's where it starts to get, tedious or repetitive. Now that doesn't mean that some features might not be buried in 4 or 5 clicks or 4 or 5 menu screens. Mobile gets a lot harder because mobile, as you can see, this is a mobile game here. So each screen has to be a lot simpler. Your UI has to have certain size fonts and certain size buttons to be usable. And so you don't want to go under certain sizes there. And you can Google, there's lots of web pages and stuff that talk about like how many pixels, a minimum button size should be, what the minimum font sizes should be, and things like that. So that's, so Google that if you're not sure about, on a mobile device, like how big some things are. Also on mobile, there's something you have to know about, that's really hard is if you have your mobile screen like this, if you're playing it this way or if you're playing it this way, your thumbs can only kind of hit certain areas. So like if you're playing here, you can see like there, my thumbs can't go all the way up, right? So if my interface design is for me to click buttons here, it's not very handy. And then some games are designed to be played one-handed. Oops, sorry. And so if it's a one-handed game, I'm having to do this. And then again, there's certain things I can't reach. Apologies. I can't reach up into these quadrants. And there's actually a bunch of stuff you can Google as well that tell you like don't put things if you're using it on a phone in certain areas, and they'll kind of give you like a green to red sort of heat map of like where it's okay to do it or not, and where you can put certain things. So you got to remember that even your screen size is even smaller on a mobile device because you can't easily and quickly reach stuff. You don't want to be doing this on your screen all the time, and that can, and on a tablet or something that gets problematic, right? So if I'm on my tablet, and again, I'm working on my tablet here, if I'm doing UI, I have to kind of be doing this. And so it's not only just this, like where it gets a little bit tiring, but if I'm doing a little bit of this, it's okay. But again, if I'm holding my hand up and I'm playing in my lap or doing whatever, that gets a lot more tiring than if I'm just using a mouse and I'm doing this, right? And so you have to be kind of thinking about, the keyboard, mouse, tablets, phones, and consoles, and each console, Xbox, PlayStation are kind of the same, but like Nintendo Switch or something's totally different. Each one of those is going to have a whole different set of rules for it. So that's something you have to be aware of, that you can't even apply that into the same space. So that's another problem. So I don't know sorry if I can't answer your question fully, because it's a tough problem. But if you find a good UX designer and find somebody that can help you, on that side, there is companies out there that can help you find it. But otherwise, just do some Googling on UX design, and try to find some ways to improve your interface flows. But it is its own set of rules. It's not something that a normal game designer would necessarily learn. But I think this, again, is something that is really critical to what our job is. And the more that we understand interface design, the better we can be a game designer. And so this is another part of our job that is pretty common. And again, just really depends on the team, and the experience. So Corey, how much public focus testing goes into this? Totally up to you. I think it's important to have a lot of focus testing, and it really just depends on the scope and scale and your budget. I mean, I've had projects where I've done very little official focus testing, and I'll have my team use it. I'll have friends and family use it. I'll get some people, if the game is soft launching, I'll get some feedback there. But interfaces to me are never done. They're just always evolving. And I don't care whether your game is officially launched or not. I'm still probably tweaking my interfaces a lot. And so the game interface is something to me that's always a work in progress. And so I make sure that my tools and my pipelines for my interface design allow me to be as agile as I can and be able to make as many changes as I can, whether that's through user testing or focus groups or, just feedback from anybody, because again, it's not done till it's, done. And I don't know that it's ever done. It's just, I'm always tweaking the UIs for most of my games until they've basically, stopped being live. Obviously if you're shipping a retail product or something, then, the interface is what it is the day you ship it. But, I very rarely will lock my interface until literally days before we finish the game, and then even less if we're going into live operations. So it's a constant iterative process. But again, if you can't afford to do, like real true focus tests and usability tests and studies like that, then at least get team members or friends and family and other people to take a look at it. All right. So again, part of a designer is setting this ambiance, in our levels, in our world, in our game. And this isn't just in the levels. This is in everything we do, and that we need it to be exciting quite often. We need it to be scary. We need to affect emotion, right? And emotion can't be affected as well through static environments. And so this could be affecting the time of day, the weather, all kinds of different types of lighting and stuff. And this gets even more, important, as I mentioned earlier about, in a like survival horror game or something, like it's all about like really darkness and just, lights are barely there. And maybe it's really, really dark except for my flashlight, and so light and light gameplay is something that can be an important part of the game. And, so we need to understand that the ambiance really sets the mood, right? And if there's thunder and lightning and rain coming down and those kinds of things, like that just makes it a whole lot more interesting quite often. Now, granted, it can be overused, and you don't want to have, the entire game be outdoors in a thunderstorm necessarily. I mean, that could get old after a while. But there is a lot there that we need to be kind of artists, in that sense. But we need to understand, like, how these things affect gameplay, right? And how does it affect emotion? Because in the end, as a game designer, our job is to create emotion. Our job, whether that's through story or through a scripted experience. So especially like you think about like lighting, right? And we're going to make it dark and we're going to be creepy and we're making a horror game. Like if something goes and it jumps out at you, like you're shocked and you're like, whoa, my God, and as a designer, like we're setting up that ambiance, right? We're setting up the jump scares. We're setting up these things, for the enemies to drop in behind us and cut us off and make us feel all stressed because now we're cut off and now we got guys on two sides of us that are attacking us and evil's coming or whatever it is, and just all that tension starts to happen. But a lot of that comes through the visual ambiance, of the world. But the visual ambiance goes way beyond just, making it look good, right? The visual ambiance goes into, like setting up that mood and atmosphere, but also should create gameplay. If it's nighttime and it's a horror game, and I got a flashlight with minimal batteries, like, I got to really think about where am I going to go? When am I going to use that flashlight? What's happening here, right? So the ambiance, the darkness, creates fear and creates emotion and allows us opportunities to create jump scares or for enemies to attack us out of the dark and all these ways that we can create tension and stuff there. And it's not just about, it's a dark level, right? So the darkness, the daytime, nighttime, or whatever it is opportunities for us as game designers to really, make our games shine. And again, lighting can be part of that. Lighting, whether it's through a flashlight or whether it's through static, lights, whether it's through, dynamic lights that, I can shoot. Can I shoot the lights out with my gun? And now I create, darkness. And does the AI respond to my lighting, right? How does the AI respond to all these things? How does the world respond to all this stuff? If you guys remember the movie, I think it was, just totally drew a blank, Pitch Black, with, Vin Diesel. And Pitch Black in that movie, when it was daytime, like the planet was kind of safe and it was a deserty sort of place. And then, the sun goes down, and, as soon as the sun goes down, all these really nasty creatures all come out, but the creatures are also attracted, to them, the humans, but they're scared off by the light, right? And, and so Vin Diesel could see them with his eyes because he had the special eyes that he had the surgery. I think he called it shining or something, allowed him to see in the dark, where the other people couldn't see the creatures. So that was an opportunity for gameplay, right? That's like having night vision goggles, on. And then, but then they were trying to keep the creatures away. They needed the light and the fire to keep them away. And as soon as that torch would start going out, it's like, oh crap, somebody's going to die, right? And it created a lot of tension. And so again, as a game designer, we're taking these things and these nuances, and we need to incorporate even more layers of complexity, more layers of depth, more layers of thought, into these things, to really try to create, a better experience, right? For the players to have a much funner player experience. And it's not just about an artist creating, some random lights just to make it look better, right? There is times and places for that, but we really need to understand, like, how does lighting affect us, especially in a horror game and a stealth game, how do shadows work, all that stuff in lighting, again, can affect things. If an enemy is using night vision goggles, for example, and it's dark, and I throw out a flash grenade, does that flash grenade, like, blind him, like, 10 times worse because he's got his night vision goggles on, and now with that, suddenly it's just completely, you can't see, and that's another way for me to, like, take advantage, of the gameplay situation that the light and the darkness and the lighting in general can create, right? And so, or, it can be the reverse. I walk into a room and there could be a light switch and I flip on the light. I mean, who knows what that's going to happen, right? I mean, the light could spill out, and now a guard outside sees the light in the room come on, and he comes to investigate it, right? Or vice versa. You could have a power generator that's powering the lights for a base, and if you take out the power generator, the lights go out, right? And so, again, the job of a game designer is to figure out these things. These are game system mechanics, and these are game level design mechanics, but we've got to understand that these mechanics go much bigger and much deeper and require, again, kind of that balance between an artist and a designer, and understanding that both of these work together in synergy when you're really working as a game designer. Now, we have to talk about music and visual effects, sound effects, anything related to sound, because as a game designer, our job is about emotions, right? And what better to heighten our emotions and affect our emotions than the music and the sound effects and things like that, and any good movie, I mean, it's like trying to watch a movie with the sound muted, right? It's never going to be a great experience, and it's never going to be as good of an experience. The sound and the sound effects layered together, and the music create so much more of an experience for us, right? And so that's the kind of thing that we need to be very aware of. Now, we generally will have an audio designer who might be doing all of the effects and or the music, and they'll be helping us. But again, it's our job to kind of drive that. Like we may kind of work with them a little bit, but we need to say like, hey, okay, like we're going to come into this fight, and I really need some like intense, like high paced, fast action music here that's just really like crazy. But then after that fight, I want them to start feeling kind of scared, and it's going to be kind of dark, and I'm going to lower the lights down here, and I want the music to get really creepy and weird, and and then we're going to come out here, and it goes into a big crescendo with lots of sound as we get in close to this waterfall, and then suddenly this big thing happens, and and the sound design of a game can have so much impact on how we're feeling subconsciously as well as consciously. And so it's an interesting thing to see how sound design, especially music design, really affects us emotionally. I saw an interview one time with John Williams. If you guys don't know who he is, he's probably the most famous music composer of all time, arguably, who did small movies like Star Wars and Indiana Jones and, a few little things like that. And I saw an interview with him after, I believe it was one of the Indiana Jones movies. And the reporters, he was walking out of the premiere of the movie, and the reporters were all up there congratulating him and going like, just, oh my God, it was the best music ever. I can't believe like how amazing the music was. And they just kept praising him. And he kind of started to cry. And he was very upset. And everybody was like, what's wrong? Like, that was the best music we've ever heard. And he turned to the press and he said, but you heard it. And that was a very telling thing, right? His music is not designed to be heard. His music is designed to be experienced, right? There's a big difference. So as game designers, how do you make your players experience the world? How do you make them experience something? They don't need to be consciously aware of, I'm listening to this song, and this song is pumping me up, and this song is, got me all whatever, and I'm singing to it. There's a time and a place for that, right? But there's a time and a place for music affects our souls. Music affects, how we feel. And most of that can be very subtle. And what's even more complicated in games is that, music can also be dynamic. Our music systems don't have to just play, one pre-recorded track to one pre-recorded track to one pre-recorded track. This does not have to be a CD on loop, right? This does not have to be, Troy's play mix, and it's just going to play these songs, right? The way and how we play these songs and the technology that we have in programs like Fmod or WWise or other dynamic audio software now, like we can literally start to affect these things in real time, and we can know like the tempo of the music could even increase as more and more enemies kind of come in, as the player's health starts getting lower. All these kinds of things can affect our music, can affect our game, and therefore can affect our emotions, right? So as a game designer, you need to be thinking about that. Because again, your job, one more time, is to affect emotion. That's what makes a game fun. That's what makes it exciting. That's there. But again, it's got to be subtle. You can't just like whack them over the head and say, listen to this music. Look how dark this is. And look how scared this is, right? These are things that affect us emotionally and affect us through our experience. And they have to be thought of. These have to be planned for. These are not just random things that happen. This is deep psychology that we're using here as a game designer, right? This is not something that's just kind of casual. And, and then next is visual effects. And in fact, I'm going to add a line here really quick that I'm going to talk about. Just reminding me of. And then... and even like sound effects, lastly, is just, being able to go into the sound effects and, and how is it going to, do I hear the steps? Because I might be in a room and I might be like hiding and I just hear, and as this creature is like walking towards me and you're like, oh crap, this thing's coming. It's coming. It's getting closer. The noise is getting louder. We can use all kinds of 3D spatial sounds now and 3D, things. And our music and our effects can be super advanced these days, right? And that's the kind of stuff that we need to be thinking through as game designers, right? It's not just like, oh yeah, there's some sound effects. Like, throw them in wherever. Like these things are conscious choices that we're making to really make our game better. Next is animation. And I won't touch on this a lot, but animation, again, has a lot that drives emotion, right? Like, how is a guy look visually, and a character and how he moves has a lot to do with how we perceive him, right? Is he threatening you and he's doing this, or is he just kind of like, yeah, I'm okay, whatever, and whatever that thing is. But we need to work with our animators just in the same way that we do work with our lighting guys, with our audio guys, with our visual effects guys, and whether we're trying to make a big explosion in the game that scares us and it does something cool, or whether so we need to understand how this all works together, right? And then some of the stuff is all tied together. Like if you think about a weather system, and we have like wind, and now wind is going to affect animation. Like animation isn't just characters and creatures. Animations can be like just a creaky sign that's just blowing in the wind real slightly. And now we got some sound effects, like and so we've got an animation. We've got a wind affecting it, and that wind can be dynamic and be kind of going, hard or slow, and the physics behind that animation can be driving that, and then it affects the sound effects more and more, and just kind of creates a creepy atmosphere, the Wild West kind of like things, and just this really quiet town, and it's really dark, and then these creaky signs and the brush rattling in the wind, and we're seeing a little bit of animation in a bush and in a tree, some stuff blowing on the ground, and then can click, across the thing, and all these things, like whether we realize it or not, are adding to our emotional state, right? And we may get a little bit like, oh, okay, this doesn't matter, but we also like, ooh, this can really matter a lot. Next, we'll talk about psychology. That was one thing I forgot to add in here to kind of other things, is that as a game designer in our job, a significant amount of our job is about psychology. A significant amount of our job is about understanding players and players' behavior, meaning that there's science behind a lot of what we do. So if you think about memory theory and all these kinds of things, there's just a tremendous amount of stuff that goes into like, how do people learn, what scares them, what makes them happy, what people like and don't like, the types of colors that they use and don't use, all these things. And you look at like psychology and stuff, there's a huge amount of stuff there that's very relevant to it. And for those of you that are interested in psychology, as a side note, if you go to my LinkedIn page, just search my name, Troy Dunniway, on LinkedIn. On there's a bunch of posts, and I've written a bunch of articles on game development stuff in general on my LinkedIn page, on my blog, on my LinkedIn. And on that is a bunch of articles on psychology, and most of them are like 20 to 40 pages long, and I talk in really deep depth about the psychology and the use of psychology in game design. So if you weren't aware of psychology being a part of game design, it's a huge part of what we are. It's really a lot of the science behind what we do. And a lot of game designers don't quite realize there's actually science to what we do. And they just kind of think it's all kind of gut instinct and kind of in here. But really, I do a lot of studying of psychology. I read a lot of books on psychology, and try to understand, again, just like what affects people and why does that affect them? How does that affect them? And all the way down to like, understanding how people learn, understanding how people remember things, all this kind of stuff. All that stuff is psychology, right? And so just keep and be aware of that. Again, you don't have to be a psychologist. You don't have to understand that stuff. But even the idea of, like we talked earlier about interface design. Interface design is a lot of psychology and user experience, right? And so there's a lot of psychologists, and in fact, a lot of psychologists go into UX design, and there's a direct correlation between psychology and UX. Even like what color your button is, and and the size of the button, all these things. They're using psychological principles of designing these things, and so again, whether you're doing this in game system design, stories, all these kinds of things, at the heart of all this stuff is psychology. So again, part of our real job is to really understand the psychology behind a lot of things. So just, if you're not aware of that, you don't understand it, like it's definitely worth doing some research about, the use of psychology in games. So lastly, since we've got about 10 minutes left, I want to talk about testing and tuning. And again, this is not something that, I have time to cover in depth today. I know some of you, are passionate about, being a tester or have been a tester and understanding this, but as a game designer, again, there's only so much we can do on our own, and we need to ultimately do what they call focus testing, where we go out and put the game in front of other people, or usability testing, which is kind of similar, where we get people to use our game, and then we get feedback and we see like, how hard is it? How easy is it? Do they get confused? Do they get lost? Do they understand what to do, when to do it? All these kinds of things are a type of testing that are really for designers to find problems in our design, right? So the focus testing, user testing people are really kind of like our right hand, in that they're really finding our problems, our bugs, our issues as a game designer, right? But then the other side of it is that the bug testers or QA testers are really there often to be kind of fixing the programming bugs. Not to say those aren't a lot of our bugs too, but there's a lot of bugs there that they're also kind of fixing. And then it's this very iterative process, and that we as game designers will build something that we either test it ourselves or iterate on it ourselves, and then we get others maybe on our team to iterate on it, and test it, and it gets bigger and bigger as we get into more and more people, and getting even into an open beta or something where we get people playing and we're like looking at their bugs. But as a game designer, quite often I get towards the end of a project where my job becomes basically to be a tester, and I'm playing my own levels, I'm playing my own game, and I'm watching other people play, and then I'm making notes, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's not very good. And one of our special skills that we've got to develop there is this ability to not be too close to our product. And it's hard because we often were the ones who designed it. And so we know every little in and out, and like we know we can play with our eyes closed literally, and we have to have that ability to kind of detach ourselves from that and go like, is this really fun? Like, is this broken? Is this the way like somebody that doesn't know the game, would do it, right? Is this balanced? Is this game too hard or too easy? And that kind of thing. And a funny story, so my mentor, who taught me how to be a game designer, was this guy named Ed Killam. Ed currently works for EA, and he was worked at Totally Games on a game called X-Wing and another game called TIE Fighter, which were two of the best known games literally of all time. They were number one in the all-time games charts for a really long time. And Ed was the designer of X-Wing and TIE Fighter, but he had a programmer background. And he then, after he hired me at a company called Ronin Entertainment, he decided to go back to being a programmer, CTO, technical director type guy, absolutely brilliant guy and one of the most amazing guys, in the world. And Ed was the one that, taught me my craft, way back when I was getting started. But I always remember a story in X-Wing in that, literally, I think they were like 1 or 2 days away from shipping the game, and he was playing the game, and he just went, the game's too hard, and everybody's like, no, it's perfect. Like, what are you going to do? And Ed literally he reduced all of the stats like by 50% of like all the enemies, basically made the game like half as easy, or twice as easy, whatever I say. And so the game just got way easier. And so the entire team, the testers, everybody were like, oh my God, you just killed the game. Like now the game's just going to be like so easy and like nobody's going to like it. And Ed was like, no, this is too hard. We're too close to it. And sure enough, the game went on to be one of the all-time greatest games ever. And that was him literally making a gut decision at the very last second because he realized that they were too close to the game. They had been playing it too much. And their skill sets, to play this shooter, this fight game, had gotten so good that to them it was really easy. But a casual player like myself trying to pick it up and play it for the first time was going to just completely lose. And so that's, again, that tuning ability of being able to know, like, how do I tune it and balance it can be really hard. We had a similar problem in Ratchet Deadlock. I had to basically, we didn't get the ability to carry over stats and carry over stuff until just like maybe a week before the game launched. And I had to literally, I think I had 2 days maybe to balance the entire game and basically play through it and kind of go like, oh, wait, adjust all these stats, adjust all these things. It was just a nightmare, and we did it, but it was a close call, and that that shouldn't have happened that way, but it did. And quite often as designers, we get stuck in those kind of situations where we have to do a significant amount of testing and tuning and balancing stats. And then in games that are like live operations, a lot of those games don't even a lot of the live operated games like never get polished and never get tuned, and never get balanced, and they just know that they never will. So like League of Legends and stuff purposely unbalance their game, and then they purposely rebalance their game every month, with new balancing, which forces players to try to do and play new characters and new tactics and use new weapons and things like that. And so we're always looking for these edge cases. We're always looking for these things that are going to break it. Is there one weapon? Is there one attack? Is there one character or something that's unbeatable or too good or too bad or whatever? And as game designers, we're constantly looking for that and constantly trying to balance that. And then, did I mention iterating? Yes, we iterate on these things. This is that phase where we're going to change things 1,000 times. We're going to keep trying over and over and over again. This is kind of the boring, monotonous part of our jobs, and that we just have to keep testing and tracking these things, and it can get a little bit tedious, but it's a really important part of our job. And again, like I mentioned in the beginning of this, like being a QA tester and just playing games all day sounds like a great job until you've played the same game 1,000 times, and then you're like, oh my God, like I'm so done with this. And so it takes a tremendous amount of iteration, tremendous amount of redoing things, and you're just going to constantly be throwing things out and starting over, and you have to be able to do that and go like, yeah, this didn't work. Like that wasn't fun. Okay, like let's change this weapon, or let's change that skill, or change that stat, or change out these characters. And so your testing and tuning, your iteration is about fixing bugs. It's about getting things to run at frame rate. It's about getting things to be technically competent so it's not going to crash, or have other kinds of problems. You might be, watching out for hackers and making sure, things there, aren't happening. So, there's just lots and lots of reasons of why, you're going to test and tune and go into QA. But, the QA cycle, for a game designer is quite often, again, your QA teams will focus on usually a specific thing. Like they may go in and try to break the weapons, and they'll try to figure out how that happens, and they'll basically usually spend days or weeks on one thing, and then they'll write up all the bugs on that one side. And then for designers, one of our problems though, especially like level designers, is quite often we are working on our game systems to the very last minute, but we're also getting all these bugs, and so we need to implement new things, but we need to test and balance things, and we need to fix bugs. And so we really have like 3 or more different sets of tests or tasks, that we need to do, and that can get really tricky, and so so it's kind of one of those things where we have to be aware of that. We have to be cognizant of that and understand, what our process is, in that, are we going to fix things? Are we going to balance things? Or are we going to create new things? And so this testing and tuning process loop can get really confusing for you if you're not used to doing it, because it's something that's, can be really challenging. So anyhow, we've got just a couple minutes left. Does anybody have any questions? I've kind of reached the end of the conversation. But if there's any questions left, please holler. But yes, in short, you have to constantly be learning as a game designer, right? You have to constantly be trying to figure out, how to polish our craft, both as game designers, and understanding that, there's every genre of game, whether you're doing an RTS, an RPG, whatever it is, MMORPG, all these things, they're all different sets of rules, right? And then as competition changes and things like that, and we have to be aware of that, right? We have to understand like what is the rules of each game that we're making, what are the rules of each thing. And so we're constantly like learning new rules, because, we may think that like, oh, we know FPSs, and like FPSs have done X up until now. And then one seminal game will come out and just change everything. I would say like Apex Legends, most recently did that, where, it was simple, small, changes they did. And, thank you, Corey. And those changes, dramatically changed, the game and the industry. And, they sold, I think, 75 or 100 million, or not sold, but at least had downloads of 75 or 100 million copies, in a very short period of time. And so that's the kind of thing that, is, important for you to understand, right? So anyways, again, the job of the game designer is not easy. It's honestly one of the hardest jobs I think in the world. I mean, I've been doing it for 30 years. It's really bloody hard. I mean, and it's just, you're constantly learning, which I love, but but it's also just, it's high pressure, it's high stress, and it's pretty intense. But at the same hand, we're making games. Like, how cool is that, right? So live your dreams. If you believe and you want to become a game designer, go for it. It's going to be a lot of hard work, but it's going to be super rewarding in the end. So I really hope that if you're thinking about becoming a game designer, that nothing I've said in the last few weeks has scared you away. Again, if you haven't seen my other live streams, go back and check out the other 40 or so episodes, and see how that's going to see what you think there. But there's lots and lots of stuff about being a game designer, and this is just tip of the iceberg. Even the 100 or so hours that I've live streamed, like, I'm just skirting the edge of what being a game designer is really about. So just be aware that it's a challenging job, but it's also by far the most rewarding job I could ever imagine doing. So it's definitely worth all the hard work. So have a great week, everybody. Yeah, game launch parties are always fun. So is all of our game shows, E3 and all that kind of stuff. There's lots of rewards. We definitely, work hard and play hard. And that's the fun of the industry. There's lots of amazing people, in this industry, lots of creative people, lots of technical people, lots of kind of everything. And thanks, Big Lob. Thanks, Casey. And everybody have a great week, and we'll hopefully see you next week. And I got to figure out what we're going to start on next week, but we'll be starting a new topic next week, and we'll see where that goes and where that takes us. So if anybody's got any ideas that they want to, about future topics on these talks, please DM me and give me some ideas, because I got to figure that one out still. So, all right, take care, everybody, and have a great week. Bye now.